Good evening. This is the CBS Sunday Night News. I'm Charles Osgood. The U.S. dollar dipped below 145 yen in Monday morning trading in Tokyo. That is lower than it has ever been since modern exchange rates were set after World War II. And it comes as Japan is trying to head off penalty tariffs announced last week against certain Japanese products by the Reagan administration. From Tokyo, Barry Peterson reports.
Japan's money market is reacting to the threatened tariffs in a bad way, the dollar plunging to lows never seen before. The dollar, said one analyst, may collapse. That means the yen is rising, making Japanese goods even more expensive on world markets. That will cut sales. So stocks are tumbling on the Tokyo Exchange. Hardest hit, Japanese companies that make their money selling exports overseas. Prime Minister Nakasone heads for Washington in a month, and there is hope here that American retaliation, American anger, may be blunted by then. If it isn't, it may not be Americans, but Korean or Taiwanese electronic manufacturers who would be the big winners. They already undersell the Japanese in the American market. With no barriers of their own to face, they could soon outsell the Japanese as well. As for the average Japanese, recent polls show their warm feelings toward the United States are ebbing. There's a very real fear here that a good friendship is going bad. Barry Peterson, CBS News, Tokyo.
Washington was not at all pleased when Israel appointed the man who allegedly recruited Jonathan Pollard to spy against the United States, commander of the big Tel Nof Air Base in Israel. Today, Lieutenant Colonel Aviam Sella resigned his command. His statement was read by an Israeli military spokesman.
The deterioration in Israel-U.S. relations and my concern for the future ties between the two countries and for relations with the American Jewish community have induced me to ask you to release me from my duties as the commander of the Tel Nof base.
Colonel Sella will stay in the Israeli Air Force, but presumably in some job that won't require dealing with Americans. Former President Jimmy Carter, now in Israel after visiting various Arab capitals, said today that he found a dramatic change in the attitude of Arab leaders, and that Syria's Hafez Assad is now willing to recognize Israel and to deal directly with it in an international conference. Mr. Carter's message that the Arabs, and especially the Syrians, have a new, more reasonable attitude towards Israel may not be too convincing to those who worry not about Assad's attitude, but about his weapons. From the State Department, Bill McLaughlin reports.
Syria is readying its Soviet-built jet fighter and missile squadrons with the capability of launching a massive chemical attack. Intelligence sources say that Syria now has the greatest chemical weapons capacity in the Middle East, a stockpile that experts fear now threatens Israel. After 5 years of weapons research, Syria is producing large quantities of sarin nerve gas, one of the deadliest poisons known to man. The gas causes instant paralysis and certain death.
Syria is a terrorist nation. They're going to look for the ultimate terrorist weapon. If they can't get a nuclear weapon, there's going to be chemical weapons.
Western intelligence sources say Syria's nerve gas project is part of its overall effort to gain strategic parity with Israel, with whom it has fought and lost 3 wars. Syria has turned to West Germany and companies like the Schott Glaswerke in Mainz for much of its chemical weapons technology. Syria has reportedly paid West German firms $20 million to build 10 chemical plants in Syria and to train Syrian personnel. And now that Syria has what's called the poor man's atom bomb, intelligence experts, along with Israel, are worried that Syria may one day share that deadly weapon with the terrorist gangs it supports. Bill McLaughlin, CBS News, the State Department.
Pope John Paul II is off this week on a tour of South America. One stop in particular presents him with some difficult problems and some opportunities. Bert Quint reports.
The Pope spoke today of his forthcoming visit to one of the world's most repressive countries, Chile, but he referred only to a peacemaking effort of the past, his successful mediation in a territorial dispute between Chile and Argentina in 1979. And he said nothing of the violent demonstrations in Chile of recent days, of the strained relations between the church and the government, or of the plea of Chileans in exile that he speak out against the rightist dictatorship of General Augusto Pinochet.
I think he's going to talk about the human right, of course, but he cannot, for diplomatic reasons, talk very strongly. I'm not quite sure that he understands very well our problems.
There are bishops in Chile who do understand those problems. One this month called Pinochet's regime immoral. That drew a formal protest from Pinochet. In effect, he told the Vatican to keep out of Chile's business. The question now is whether John Paul II will support his bishops on the scene or try to patch up the severely damaged relations between his church and the Chilean government. Bert Quint, CBS News, Rome.
Coming up on the CBS Sunday Night News, springtime in the Midwest. Not a pretty sight.